So how do we identify with the gender and the associated behaviors? Are we born with this coded in our genes, or do we learn unintentionally? Or is there a more formal manner in which we learn about our gender? As you may expect, families are the primary influences on gender identity. However, it does not end there. Let's explore where our gender becomes from and where we become gendered. Now, you may find the small breakout boxes in your textbook very helpful. They are short little vignettes of individuals' perspectives, and you may find that very useful. It's been argued that gender development is an unconscious process around identification and internalization of gender, your gender identity. The psychoanalytic theory, it posits that identity formation is largely an unconscious process through identifying and identification and internalization. A person's core gender identity is shaped through the early years in life. Now, that's an early philosophy from Freud. Now, Freud wrote that anatomy is destiny, which meant that the sex of a child determined with which parent a child would identify and how that child's psyche would develop. Now, there's been limited empirical support for Freud's theories. A lot of it was sort of talks, they were ideas, they were thoughts, but they weren't well researched and documented in regards to scientific study. Later theorists rejected Freud's notion of destiny, but still focused on the family dynamics as crucial to the formation of gender identities. Now, the initial identification of our gender identity occurs within the primary caregiver and child relationship through different developmental paths. It's to ensure that males and female, through the male and female infants. Now, children are of both sexes form their first identification with adult women, typically. Around 3 years old, male and females children development is more divergent. Girls continue to identify with their mothers in a closer relationship. Mothers recognize and emphasize similarities between themselves and their daughters, leading to stronger identification of daughters with mothers. Now, in contrast, sons, they must separate or differentiate themselves from mothers. These different early family relationships for boys and girls result in different roles internalized by male and female children. Now, girls tend to develop a feminine identity within the relationships, which leads to an emphasis on closeness, personal communication. Focus on continuing relationships encourages girls to become more nurturing and relationally oriented. Now, boys, they tend to form a more masculine identity by distancing themselves from mothers, preferring interactions with activities, specifically with groups and changing members all the time. Therefore, they learn to define themselves relatively independently of others. Now, children in single-parented families may have trouble finding available models for both genders. Masculine genders can be difficult to grasp if lacking a strong relationship with males. Boys may define masculinity in negative forms, like not like mother. Now, girls' social development with personal relationships, including mothers, boys become more achieving and independent over time, and girls become more nurturing and relationally oriented. Friendships matter a lot more. Now, ego boundaries are also really an important point here. Ego boundaries are also developing alongside gender identity. Ego boundaries represent the intrapsychic structures that define where an individual stops and where the rest of the world begins. Feminine individuals tend to emphasize connections with others and have, a thinner or more permeable ego boundary. This is more likely gives them the feeling and experiences of feelings with others and their own. So this more permeable ego boundary means more people are welcome in, and there's less barriers to keep yourself from sharing with other people. There's that more closeness and that more sharing and of ideas, thoughts, and feelings. Now the masculine tends to emphasize separation from others and have a more rigid or thicker ego barriers and ego boundaries, I'm sorry. Individuals with thicker ego boundaries have a clear sense of differentiation between self and others and are less likely to experience the feelings of others as their own. You could describe that as empathy. Now, parents communicate about gender to their children in numerous ways. Parents label and respond to their infants according to gendered stereotypes within hours of birth. Now, what's interesting about this is that people will routinely say that they don't do it, but if you watch people and observe what they do, there's this unconscious labeling stereotypically of both boys and girls. Now, part of that is just through our own personal history and how we've learned from our family and how we see others express thoughts and feelings towards their infant children. It just becomes something that we do. Now, we may later in our adult life treat our children differently, but a lot of time we begin right down the same path has been done generations before. Now, parents foster gendered behaviors by encouraging independence and competitiveness and aggression in their sons, and more emotional expressiveness and gentleness with their daughters. Now, mothers and fathers typically talk more intimately with daughters than sons, and male and female parents tend to engage differently in terms of their parenting styles. Now, this isn't to say that any of this is staying static. Of course, this has been changing over time, and we've been seeing a shift in the way that parents interact with their children, and that degree of what is masculine today and what is feminine today has been shifting over time. But it's only shifting. It hasn't made a shift. So there's still quite a diverse experience for both men and women and how they're being raised and how we raise our children. Now, mothers typically make talk the center of their relationship with sons and daughters. The talk focuses on providing comfort, on security, on emotional development. While fathers talk to children less than mothers, they talk more about with them than they have in previous generations. Now, fathers typically focus on playing with children in ways that is physically stimulating and exciting. Their communication focuses on encouraging initiative, achievement, independence. Often in the relationship, the relation to the activity that is focus of the interaction, not necessarily the communication level that's going on between the two. Mothers are more likely than fathers to talk about sex topics with children, particularly daughters. Now, if you Toys R Us is closing, so we can't necessarily go there anymore, but go to some of the other places and go through the toys department. You'll see that toys, games are often very stereotypical gender separated. Now, you'll start to see some shifts in that because there's been more social pressure to do so. But toys, games, chores, they all communicate a gender expectation for children. Domestic chores are more frequently assigned to girls, while outdoor work is generally assigned to boys. Now, in general, boys experience more rigid socialization into masculinity than girls do into femininity. When we consider things like the parental modeling that occurs in terms of masculinity and femininity, the influences that influence children's understanding about gender. And so when we consider heterosexual parents who adhere to traditional sex roles provide models for children of both sexes. Children are more likely to learn about women that are supposed to be nurturing, clean, and cook, while men are supposed to be the one that earns the money, makes the decisions, and is more emotionally controlled. The increase in single-parented families, dual-income families, blended families, and gay and lesbian parented families provides a much more diverse model of gender. Now, parents can model gendered attitudes about physical appearance. For instance, fathers who engage in strenuous physical activities and mothers who complain about their weight communicate ideas about masculinity and femininity. Now, this is one of those examples where it's done rather, very informally and really unintentionally. As adults, we are affected by all the social cues that are out there that let us know how we're supposed to be. How big are we supposed to be? What are our abs supposed to be like? What shape are we supposed to have? What are the things we're supposed to be interested in? And so we are affected by those things, and those activities that we participate in and the things that we communicate to one another at home will shape some of what our kids will pick up. Because remember, one of the key things about children and how they learn is children will learn what you do over what you say. Okay, now let's move on. Now, we've been looking at the unconscious view of how gender is developed. Now, let's review the more personal side of gender drama. Gender and personal identity is influenced by other factors, and we interact with many different things over time. So growing up, masculine can include 6 major elements, and we're going to review them one at a time. Now, these aren't a complete list, but it gives you a sense about general perspective about what it is to be masculine, and we'll review what it is to be feminine. And you will notice some of this will ring true for you and some of it won't. But again, that's just to emphasize the shift is moving from what masculinity has been defined and where it might be shifting and moving towards in the future. So the number one thing, not number one in terms of what is masculinity, but the first thing that we're going to touch base on here is don't be female. That's a strong directive for men. Males are socialized not to show sensitivity and vulnerability. Now we'll get to how that's changing, or as far as another area of masculinity in a moment. So the first is don't be female. This needs to separate, what is it to be male and what is it to be female. Secondly, masculinity is shown to be, you're as a male expected to show that you can be successful professionally and in other activities. Men are expected to be better than or more powerful than others and to be able to provide for their family. Now that has historically been a very big part. Back in the early 1900s and beyond, and certainly up to the 1950s and 60s, even into the 70s, men were the ones that were out working and bringing home the bacon, as it were, to have a family be successful. So it was a very big part of what it was to be male and masculine. And it was in the 60s, I would imagine, that we saw more of this shift starting to happen. And this is where, masculinity in terms of providing for the family begun to shift, and women becoming a little bit more self-reliant, breaking into the 70s, into the 80s, and certainly into the 90s. Masculinity, this is 3, masculinity requires aggression. Now this can be linked to competition, dominance, and even violence. And certainly when we look at the degree of domestic violence, it's largely men to women, but it's not exclusively. But masculinity has historically been defined in part by the level of aggression. Now oftentimes, certainly as expressed in competition, be aggressive and being dominant, being the best, but even in terms of violence. Number 4, a masculine role requires men to be interested in sex at all times. Sexual conquest is a cornerstone of masculinity. Historically, it's always been that way, but certainly we're seeing some shifts and changes in that in today's world. But the idea that men, it was only in 1982 in Canada where it became illegal for a man to rape his wife. Prior to that, it was okay because it was a part of what it is to be masculine and what the roles in families were seen to be. Now that certainly wouldn't be seen as acceptable today. It still does happen, but that's part of how things are shifting and changing. Masculinity for 5 demands self-reliance. Men are expected to be self-controlled, independent, and not in need of others. To be independent, to be able to provide, to be self-reliant, to be not independent of other people, or not to be dependent on other people, has been a part of what masculinity has been historically. And again, you're seeing some change in that, because we're seeing a higher degree of egalitarian in households among younger people than we've had in the past. And then lastly, 6, and this is a more recent sort of contradictory theme to masculinity, and it embodies and transcends this traditional view of masculinity. Men are expected to embody the traditional masculine traits as was mentioned above, yet be sensitive and egalitarian. Now, egalitarian, if you're unfamiliar, patriarchal is male-dominated, matriarchal is female-dominated. Egalitarian is balanced, so there's an equal share of roles and responsibilities in the household and the family, and the way that a relationship between two people grows. And so, more recently then, this transition period is men are expected to have male masculinity traits, as mentioned in the previous 5, but also start to bend towards this more sensitive and egalitarian perspective. And of course, this causes a conflict in terms of role identity and gender identity. So, some counselors believe that striving to live up to the social ideals of masculinity is responsible for this widespread male depression, which society is unwilling to acknowledge since it contradicts the social prescriptions for masculinity. Now, that's just looking at a very general perspective, and I know many people might argue that that's not necessarily accurate. But men have, for many generations, lived up to that degree of what is masculine, and we are going through a transition. So it is interesting to see how that takes place and what will be the effect, in the same way that women have gone through a change of what it is to be feminine. And let's look at growing up feminine, and we'll look at this in terms of there's been 2 distinct versions of femininity. One version suggests that a woman has it all. Since they're now able to be professional, have professional opportunities, and they have more egalitarian marriages, and therefore they have it all. On the other hand, statistics show that women are unlikely to advance to the highest professional levels, that career women still do the majority of the household and housework and childcare, and that crimes against women are rising. And so we have this contradictory 2-themed perspective about femininity. Which is it? And again, we're seeing this cultural shift between where it's been and where it might be going. So let's look at the 5 major themes of femininity. First, the first theme is that appearance counts. Women are evaluated on their looks, and they are encouraged to meet the cultural ideals of what is attractive, and usually it includes slenderness, and that's also starting to shift and change. The cultural ideals for femininity and beauty reflect a white standard. If you look around the world and you were to ask people around the world, what is a beautiful woman, or what is attractive in terms of women, depending upon where you were, you would get any number of different descriptions of shapes, sizes, demeanor of what a woman would be to be attractive and desirable in another culture. So in North America, it's largely a white standard that's used. Now, you could still be arguing, in a sense, that, well, feminine view has been changing. And of course it is. But look at the media. Look at social media. Look at advertising. They don't advertise, for the most part, a wide variety of women. They often still use an attractive standard for how they use women in media. And so that's an indicator that it's still out there and it's still prevalent. Secondly, the second theme is that in terms of femininity, sensitivity and caring, comforting and conforming to the expectations of other women as caregivers is really important. And so sensitivity, being able to demonstrate caring and be able to comfort others in terms of being the caregiver of children, of your family, and if family, extended family were to be ill, parents, even the parents of, say, of a woman's husband, it's usually the woman who takes on the caregiver role. And that's because it's that entrenched in our society of what a woman is supposed to be. Now, 3 is being feminine also involves being treated negatively by others, both culturally and physically. Females may internalize these cultural views. Many women and girls engage in covert social aggression towards one another. We've seen this a lot in regards to the social media and shaming that occurs, that a lot of that shaming is directed towards women. It's not as much directed towards men. And so that's an indication again about this sort of shift is occurring and a lot of attention goes towards women and that it involves being treated negatively and somehow that's okay as opposed to treating men negatively, not quite as okay. 4th, the 4th expectation is that a woman should be a superwoman. This means balancing responsibilities in the home, the workplace, and the romantic partnerships, and excelling at them all the time. Check out some of the women's magazines. Essentially, they're all about all the things that women should be doing and how well they should be doing them, but not about the shared responsibilities and the roles and what a man can be doing in that same relationship. And then 5, the final theme of femininity is that there is no single definition or meaning of femininity today. For instance, a woman may be criticized or praised for being assertive and ambitious in a career. And so you can see there's a huge shift and change, and everyone in the class is a part of shaping what is masculinity and what is femininity. Do we sign up for and reflect the traditional view, or are we a part of a new view? Either way, it's not exactly easy. It's a challenge. So, what about people who grow up outside of these conventional genders? Those who grow up outside of traditional gender roles may face difficulties and challenges. People who are thought to be gay, lesbian, transgendered, or otherwise queer may face social isolation and taunting. It's hard to find role models and it's hard to find acceptance. Transgendered people face particular challenges about their gender performance and living day to day in a life that is cisgendered, as that cisgendered people do not face. And so it makes the life of a person going through, who am I, more challenging. Again, about having appropriate role models to look to and take direction from and gain some acceptance. And so you see these challenges experienced on a day-to-day basis.